They weren't supposed to fight. They weren't meant to lead. And yet they did, in the blood-soaked fields of medieval Europe. In the stone halls of forgotten castles, women rose where history told them to kneel. Their names were buried, their stories erased, but not anymore. These are the untold tales of the fearless, the forgotten, and the unstoppable. Backhand index pointing, right, if you thought medieval history was all about kings and knights. Think again. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell icon, and join us as we uncover the legendary women who defied empires, broke every rule, and rewrote history from the shadows. Joan of Arc is often remembered as a lone female warrior of the medieval era, the teenage girl who claimed divine visions and led French forces against the English. But what history rarely tells us is that she was far from alone. Across Europe and beyond, there existed a silent army of women who picked up swords, rode into battle, and led their people with a courage that rivaled any king. Their names might have been erased in the popular textbooks, but their stories still echo in the ruins of castles and the blood-stained fields where kingdoms rose and fell. Take the story of Matilda of Tuscany, an 11th century noblewoman who wasn't just a bystander to chaos of the Holy Roman Empire. She was at its very center. Known as La Grande Contessa, Matilda commanded armies in defense of the Pope during the investiture controversy, a time when church and state were locked in a deadly power struggle. Unlike many noble women who managed affairs from behind castle walls, Matilda strapped on armor and rode into combat. Her military prowess wasn't just symbolic. She successfully led troops through mountainous terrain, ambushed enemy supply lines, and held stronghold against superior forces. Chroniclers from both sides recorded her tactical brilliance, but even more than that, they recorded her authority. Men bowed before her not just out of respect, but out of necessity. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, another figure emerged, perhaps even more enigmatic, named Khawla bint al-Azwar. Though she lived slightly earlier, in the 7th century, her story was still widely retold throughout medieval Islamic literature, influencing generations of women in regions later touched by medieval culture. Khawla, dressed in all black and veiled, once rode into battle so fiercely that enemy soldiers mistook her for a high-ranking male commander. Her swordsmanship and courage during the Battle of Yarmouk reportedly saved dozens of lives and turned the tide of skirmishes. Her identity was only revealed after the fighting ended, shocking both her enemies and allies. Her story, preserved in poetry and oral traditions, was used not just to glorify bravery, but to remind listeners that strength was not bound by gender. In Scandinavia, the sagas told of shield maidens, fierce women who sailed with the Vikings and fought alongside men. While some historians have debated whether shield maidens were myth or reality, archaeological discoveries in the 21st century changed everything. In Birka, Sweden, a grave initially assumed to belong to a male warrior due to the presence of weapons, gaming pieces, and war gear was later confirmed through DNA analysis to belong to a woman. This revelation reignited interest in female Viking warriors and opened the floodgates for re-examining Nordic legends. These women didn't just defend homes while men were away. They stood shoulder to shoulder, axe to axe, sword to sword. Their presence wasn't ceremonial, it was tactical. And they earned their place with blood and bravery. Further south in Eastern Europe, we encounter the tale of Olga of Kiev, a ruler whose vengeance would send a chill down the spine of any medieval warlord. After her husband was assassinated by a rival tribe, the Drevlians, Olga didn't just mourn, she planned. Under the guise of diplomacy, she invited Drevlian emissaries and then had them buried alive. She then led a brutal military campaign, exacting revenge not just through war, but psychological warfare. One account tells how she requested birds from a besieged city and then tied flaming sulfur cloth to their legs, releasing them back to their nests inside city walls, setting the entire settlement ablaze. Though much of her life was consumed by politics and survival, her battlefield tactics were sharp enough to leave a permanent scar on Slavic history. Olga later converted to Christianity and was canonized as a saint, an ironic twist for a woman whose hands were once stained with strategic bloodshed. And then there was Nicola de Lahaye, an Englishwoman who during the early 13th century found herself not just defending her family's honor, but literally holding the keys to the kingdom. As constable of Lincoln Castle, She held one of the most strategic locations in England during King John's reign, a time of civil war and rebellion. When rebel barons and French troops besieged the castle in 1216, Nicola refused to surrender. Despite being in her 60s, she managed the garrison, negotiated supplies, and inspired loyalty in her troops. Her resilience held out long enough for William Marshal to arrive with reinforcements, securing a royalist victory that shifted the course of the First Barons' War. Afterward, even King John acknowledged her strength, famously calling her a woman faithful and beloved. These stories weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a forgotten pattern, a parallel history of women who refused to stay behind the curtain. While society often dictated that a woman's role was to birth heirs and guard the hearth, the reality on the ground was different. Wars didn't pause for childbirth, plagues didn't ask for permission, and power didn't always wait for a man to wield it. These women, Joan, Matilda, Carla, Olga, and Nicola, took up arms not out of vanity or legend, but out of necessity. In their world, survival often meant action, and when kingdoms faltered, it was sometimes a woman who took command. It's easy to understand why history tried to obscure these stories. They didn't fit the narrative of medieval Europe as a man's world. They challenged the very structure of gender and authority, proving that leadership and courage had nothing to do with who wore the crown or who was allowed to. But now, centuries later, we're rediscovering their truths. And in doing so, we find not just heroines of the past, but reminders of the unbreakable spirit that has always existed beneath the surface of history. In medieval society, castles are often imagined as places where noble women were locked away, protected, silenced, or simply sidelined. But that image is only part of the truth. For many powerful women, castles were not prisons. They were command centers. From within these stone walls, noble women issued orders, managed economies, negotiated treaties, and in many cases, ruled entire regions with an iron will. Their thrones may not have always been ceremonial, but their influence echoed through stone halls and across the battlefield. One of the most striking examples of this kind of power was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born in the early 12th century, she was heiress to one of the richest provinces in France and married first to King Louis VII of France and then to Henry II of England. Her marriages gave her immense political leverage, but her real strength came from her intelligence and unwavering determination. Eleanor was more than a queen. She was a stateswoman, a patron of the arts, and a military strategist. When her sons rebelled against their father, Henry II, it was Eleanor who secretly organized their efforts, coordinating logistics from within her castle strongholds. Even after being imprisoned for over a decade, her political instincts never dulled. Once released, she returned to power, orchestrating royal marriages across Europe and acting as regent while her son, Richard the Lionheart, went on crusade. The authority she wielded from her chambers and estates shaped the future of both England and France. But Eleanor was not the only one. In the Iberian Peninsula, Urraca of Leon and Castile ruled as queen in her own right in the early 12th century, a rarity in any era. Her reign was marked by rebellion, conflict, and political maneuvering, though her authority was challenged by powerful nobles and even members of her own family. She held firm. From her castles, she issued decrees, coordinated military responses, and maintained her sovereignty during a time when most female rulers were expected to defer to male guardians. Urraca's power was not symbolic. She commanded armies, led diplomatic missions, and made strategic alliances, all from behind stone walls that echoed with the clatter of planning, not the rustle of embroidery hoops. Meanwhile, in the Holy Roman Empire, Adelaide of Italy was carving out her legacy. Widowed at a young age and imprisoned by her political enemies, Adelaide escaped and later married Otto the Great, becoming Holy Roman Empress. But it wasn't just her title that carried weight, it was her leadership. When her husband died, she acted as regent for her grandson, Emperor Otto III. From her palaces and fortified homes, she administered vast lands, settled disputes, and corresponded with religious and political leaders across Europe. She wasn't just holding power until a man came of age. She was actively shaping policy and protecting the empire from within her own fortified courts. In medieval England, one cannot ignore the fierce example of Margaret of Anjou, the wife of Henry VI, during the War of the Roses. When her husband's mental illness made him incapable of ruling, Margaret stepped into the political vacuum with fire in her heart. From her strongholds in northern England, she led Lancastrian forces into key battles, forged alliances, and even coordinated invasions. While she was vilified in Yorkist propaganda as power-hungry and unnatural, her supporters saw her as a lioness defending her cub, her son's claim to the throne. Her letters, negotiations, and war planning, often sent from heavily fortified castles, reveal a woman who not only understood politics, but was willing to risk everything for her family's survival. Margaret wasn't merely reacting to events. She was shaping them from behind the curtain of her court. Another example comes from France, where Blanche of Castile served as queen consort and later regent for her son, Louis IX. During her regency in the 13th century, France faced both internal rebellion and foreign threats. Blanche ruled with a combination of mercy and might, dispatching orders from fortified cities and managing the complex administration of the kingdom. When rebellious nobles tried to fracture the realm, she acted decisively, sending armies, enforcing taxes, and negotiating from a position of strength. Her leadership from within the fortified palaces of Paris and beyond was so effective that her son would later be canonized as St. Louis, in no small part due to stability she had provided during his youth. These noble women were not anomalies. They were part of a hidden fabric of medieval rule, woven to the corridors of stone and mortar that we now call castles. To them, those walls were not barriers. They were extensions of their authority. Castles were courts, offices, barracks, and power centers, and these women ruled from them with clarity of purpose that would humble many kings. They maintained trade networks, supervised the raising of armies, oversaw construction of roads and churches, and resolved disputes among rival factions, all while under constant threat of invasion or insurrection. Even when warfare surrounded them, these women didn't flee, they fortified. When husbands went off to crusades or foreign campaigns, it was often the wives or mothers left behind who governed in their absence. They held the keys to the armories, the vaults, and the hearts of their people. And more often than not, they were better at managing the kingdom than the kings themselves. The idea that women were passive figures in medieval life crumbles under the weight of these stories. In reality, the castle was both a shield and a sword. It was a place from which commands were issued, battles were planned, and futures were determined. These women were not just symbols of beauty or virtue. They were guardians of legacy, protectors of lands, and architects of survival. It's no coincidence that many of their achievements were later buried under layers of romanticized history and male-centered narratives. But the stones of their castles still stand in many places, whispering the truth. These fortresses, far from being silent prisons, were alive with the force of female leadership, strategic, diplomatic, ruthless when needed, and always deeply human. In telling their stories, we restore the truth. That power in the medieval world did not always wear a crown, or ride a horse, or swing a sword. Sometimes it wore a veil, signed a treaty, or sent orders sealed with wax. And sometimes it was a woman, standing behind battlements, holding the fate of an entire kingdom in her hands. Armor was heavy, and so was silence. For centuries, history has romanticized the image of chivalric knight riding into battle, but rarely do we hear the women who wore similar armor and faced the same dangers, without the same recognition. They were not always queens or saints. Many were peasant women, daughters of noblemen, or widows of fallen soldiers who took up the sword in desperate times. Others disguised themselves as men, trained in secret, and stood shoulder to shoulder with knights, enduring the brutality of war, while hiding the truth of their identity. Their struggles were not only physical, they were emotional, societal, and psychological. And yet, they fought on, driven not by glory, but by survival, duty, and an unshakable inner fire. In the chaos of 14th century warfare, a young woman named Jehanne la Pucelle, known later as Joan of Arc, captured the world's attention not simply because she claimed visions, but because she refused to back down in a world built to crush her. Her path to battle wasn't carved through inheritance or noble favor. It was forged through conviction and sacrifice. She faced interrogation, imprisonment, torture, and eventually execution, not for treason, but for daring to wear male armor and lead men into war. Her pain wasn't limited to swords and fire. It was a slow agony of being doubted, mocked, and accused at every step. Her battlefield was both the front lines of France and the inner sanctums of church courts who saw her presence as blasphemy. Yet she endured it all, not for fame, but for a vision of freedom she would never live to see realized. Her story was not unique. Across the Channel in England, under the cover of war and rebellion, women like in Bonneville armed themselves when their homes were attacked. The brutal reality of civil wars, especially during the Wars of the Roses, left many estates without male protection. Women were forced to become defenders, sometimes commanding retainers, organizing militias, and leading counterattacks to reclaim their property. These were not acts of vanity or pride. They were responses to survival. A woman defending her castle was not a political maneuver. It was a mother safeguarding her children, a widow protecting her legacy, or a sister refusing to be erased. In many cases, women were drafted into violence not by politics, but by grief. When husbands or fathers were killed, many women had no other option than to pick up the sword. The transformation from grieving widow to fierce warrior was not poetic. It was traumatic, and yet some found strength within that sorrow. Women like Caterina Sforza of Italy stood atop battlements with sword in hand, daring enemies to fire the first shot. When her husband was assassinated and political rivals stormed her city, she didn't beg for help. Instead, she led the defense herself. Her famous response to a threat, exposing herself defiantly to attackers while pregnant, became a symbol of her fearless nature. She was not just defending her city. She was making a declaration that her body, her family, and her city were not possessions to be claimed. Further east, in the Balkans and Slavic territories, peasant revolts sometimes saw women rise to leadership not because they were trained, but because the men were dead. With a sickle or staff in hand, these women fought back against feudal lords and invaders alike. Often, they were the last line of defense between pillage and preservation. Their weapons were crude, their training non-existent, but their determination unmatched. Chroniclers didn't write their names, but oral legends passed down through generations tell stories of iron grandmothers and blood sisters who defended entire villages. These women bore the pain of every loss on their backs, but refused to let that pain define them. Instead, they channeled it into action, defying the belief that only men could be heroes. Not all their struggles happened on open battlefields. For many, the internal war was just as fierce. Those who disguised themselves as men lived in constant fear of discovery. The punishment for cross-dressing could be severe, ranging from public humiliation to death. These women endured not only the physical toll of battle, but the psychological torment of hiding who they were. Their voices deepened, their hair cut short, their identities erased just to be accepted as equals on the battlefield. Some succeeded for years, fighting alongside men who never realized the truth. Others were discovered only after being wounded or killed. And still, they chose that path, not because they wanted to deceive, but because they knew it was the only way to prove their worth. Behind the armor, these women carried invisible wounds. Many lost not just comrades, but children, homes, and communities. They witnessed the deaths of those they loved and the destruction of everything familiar. Their scars were not just physical. They were embedded in their minds. Yet, unlike men, their trauma was rarely acknowledged. They had no place in veterans' halls or royal courts. When wars ended, they returned to lives that no longer fit them, told to forget the battlefield and return to the hearth. But some couldn't, and some refused. In convents, some women turned to religion after war. But even there, the battlefield followed them. Nuns in war-torn regions often tended to wounded soldiers and wrote about the horrors they had seen. Some, like Hildegard von Bingen, composed music and literature that carried the echoes of pain and resilience, though cloaked in mysticism. Others penned secret memoirs, writing down the things they couldn't say aloud. Their words became testimony to a generation of pain history refused to recognize. Some women, after the dust of war had settled, were erased completely. Chronicles that mentioned them were edited or destroyed. Sons born of battlefield encounters were hidden away or renamed. Property they fought to defend was quietly absorbed by male relatives. Yet despite all efforts to forget them, fragments of their story survived. In family records, in forgotten grave markers, in ballads sung in country inns. Hints of their existence remain. What history fails to admit is that these women did more than fight. They endured. They adapted. They bore the unimaginable and returned to life, broken yet unbowed. Their courage wasn't just on the field. It was in surviving a world that didn't know how to understand them. They were armored not only in metal but in resolve, dignity, and pain. They proved that heroism wears many faces. Not just the face of a king or knight, but sometimes the face of a mother, a sister, a lover, or a stranger in the wrong clothes on the right battlefield. Their stories, once silenced, are now resurfacing, and they remind us that the soul of war is not always masculine. Sometimes, it is a woman who bears the weight of history on her shoulders, and she does so without asking for permission or applause. She simply survives, and in doing so, reshapes what it means to be strong. They were neither queens nor saints, not the women immortalized by royal bloodlines or stained glass windows. These were the ones who walked quietly among swords and secrets, forming a web of trust, information, and defiance. In a world dominated by warfare and rigid male hierarchies, a hidden sisterhood emerged. Women who used whispers as weapons and kinship as armor, bound not by noble lineage but by necessity, strategy, and survival. They form alliances few historians ever recorded, but which often tip the scales of power. They were mothers, lovers, spies, couriers, and guardians of forbidden knowledge, each playing a role behind a curtain of battles and beneath the banners of kings. In medieval France, as war raged between rival factions, networks of noble women communicated across enemy lines, not simply out of loyalty to their blood, but to protect the lands and legacies entrusted to them. Noble women married into different houses were often caught between loyalties, but instead of choosing sides, they built bridges. Letters wrapped in cloth and sealed with family crests carried secret diplomatic messages, often smuggled through sewing baskets, religious texts, or hidden under the hems of garments. A duchess might plead for peace with her cousin across the river, while also providing intelligence about troop movements to protect her people. These silent negotiations saved villages from slaughter, avoided unnecessary battles, and bought time when all else seemed lost. In the shadows of these noble dealings operated another class of women, servants, midwives, and ladies-in-waiting. Because of their roles and access to intimate spaces, they were often underestimated by men. Yet these women became the eyes and ears of the sisterhood. They passed on information, relayed political secrets overheard during drunken banquets, and warned of betrayals whispered in candlelit corners. Some even learned to read and write in secret, using coded language to transmit reports. In monastic convents, where hundreds of women lived in quiet seclusion, scripts and ledgers were often copied and archived. But among them were subversive writers who inserted political commentary or embedded knowledge forbidden to them in religious texts. These small acts of rebellion were invisible to most, but they were sparks of resistance in an age when female autonomy was perilously rare. In the Islamic world, where trade routes crossed continents and empires, women like Al-Khizran, mother of 2 Abbasid caliphs, wielded immense influence from behind palace walls. Though she began as a slave girl, she maneuvered her way into the heart of the empire, using networks of female slaves, concubines, and servants as her agents. Through them, she gathered intelligence, shaped political decisions, and orchestrated alliances. Her palace became a web of influence stretching from Baghdad to Mecca. She wasn't the only one. Palace women across Asia and the Middle East, often referred to as members of the harem, were not mere prisoners of luxury, but active participants in political life. They exchanged messages, managed finances, funded rebellions, and at times even poisoned their enemies. Through loyalty, fear, or shared purpose, they created underground sisterhoods that changed course of dynasties. In Europe, during the Inquisition and religious persecution, women banded together to protect their families and neighbors from unjust prosecution. Many of them were labeled witches, not because of sorcery, but because of their refusal to betray others. Networks of women created systems to signal danger, hanging certain herbs outside homes, drawing symbols into dirt paths, or altering the arrangement of laundry lines. They spread warnings of incoming inquisitors or soldiers, and when needed, provided shelter and escape routes. These alliances were not born from politics, but from shared fear and determination. They understood that the only way to survive a system built to silence them was through unity. And in that unity, they found not only protection but strength. One of the most gripping examples of these silent alliances can be seen during the 100 Years' War. While kings exchanged thrones and mercenaries scorched the countryside, it was often the women who managed to keep families intact and land productive. A widow in Normandy might coordinate with a baroness in Brittany to send food, supplies, and warnings, their husbands long dead or away in battle. These women used their positions to maintain order. When mercenaries threatened their holdings, they negotiated, bribed, or even armed their own guards. To support each other, they established informal communication channels, often using nuns and friars as intermediaries. These networks helped them survive one of Europe's longest and most brutal wars. Stories also emerged from Eastern Europe, particularly among the Baltic tribes and Slavic regions. Here, priestesses and female healers held spiritual and social power. When male leaders were killed in battle or taken as slaves, these women stepped into leadership roles. They shared knowledge across villages, rituals, medicinal practices, and defense strategies. Through shared oral traditions, they passed down vital survival information. Their loyalty was not to a king, but to people around them, and in this loyalty they found sisters in distant lands facing the same fate. In times of famine, they bartered herbs for grain. In times of war, they offered sanctuary to wandering refugees. Over time, these networks of wise women became the cultural spine of resistance movements that stood against invading forces and religious conversions. This hidden sisterhood was not always formal, not always spoken aloud. It often passed from mother to daughter, from friend to friend, but its impact was undeniable. These women didn't wear crowns or command armies on horseback, yet they shaped outcomes, brokered peace, protected the weak, and preserved knowledge through the darkest centuries of medieval life. They used what society allowed, domestic roles, religious spaces, emotional intelligence, and turned it into an invisible empire of influence. No army could match the reach of a secret pass from castle to convent, from kitchen to cathedral. Their legacy is not etched in statues or carved into monuments, but it lives in the gaps of recorded history, where men wrote their conquests and conveniently left out the women who made those victories possible. Today, as historians re-examine medieval sources with sharper lens, these quiet heroines are finally being uncovered, and what we find is not just a few isolated acts of defiance, but an entire hidden network of female resistance, resilience, and power that once silently stitched itself into the very fabric of medieval survival. These women did not wait for freedom to be granted. They forged it in secret, in solidarity, and in silence. Their sisterhood, though rarely named, was among the most powerful forces in an age built to silence them. And now, centuries later, we are finally beginning to hear their voices. When we open a medieval history book, we are flooded with names of kings, knights, popes, and emperors. Their triumphs and failures fill the pages, their portraits preserved, their battles retold endlessly. But the women, those who ruled, fought, healed, led, and resisted, are conspicuously absent or reduced to footnotes, mere accessories to the stories of men. This silence is not accidental. It is a product of a calculated erasure, a deliberate rewriting of history that began the moment these women took power in a world that didn't believe they should have any. Throughout the Middle Ages, brave women stepped far outside the boundaries society set for them. They led armies, negotiated peace, governed kingdoms, and challenged both religious and social institutions. But the chroniclers, the monks, scribes, and court historians, were almost entirely male. Their worldview shaped what was recorded, what was praised, and what was forgotten. When a woman defied the norm, she wasn't admired. She was dangerous. And the easiest way to defeat danger wasn't always through battle. It was through silence. Take the case of Jeanne de Clisson, the so-called lioness of Brittany. After the French crown executed her husband without trial, Jeanne turned pirate, outfitting ships with black sails and silver weaponry. She and her sons patrolled the English Channel, targeting only French vessels, and personally beheaded captured French nobles with an axe. For over a decade, she terrorized the same monarchy that had wronged her, and yet her story barely exists in medieval records. Most of what we know about her comes from scattered chronicles and oral traditions, often discredited as legend. Why? Because she represented something terrifying, a woman who didn't beg for justice, but took it with blood and steel. Or consider the story of Joanna of Flanders, who defended the city of Hennebont in her husband's absence during the Breton War of Succession. When the enemy laid siege, she donned armor, rallied the citizens, and led a surprise attack that burned the enemy camp. Eyewitnesses were stunned. A noble woman in full armor, wielding a sword, was an image so contradictory to the feminine ideal of the time that many chroniclers wrote her out entirely. Her bravery became a whispered story rather than a celebrated one. The tools of erasure were subtle but effective. Language played a critical role. Women who ruled wisely were described as domineering. Those who were strategic were called manipulative. Courage became madness. Love became lust. Political alliances made by women were dismissed as emotional whims, while the same actions by men were hailed as genius. Even the title queen was used carefully, only valid if the woman was married to a king. A woman ruling in her own right was seen as unnatural, an anomaly to be corrected, hidden, or rewritten. Then there were the accusations. Powerful women were often painted as witches, heretics, or temptresses. Eleanor of Aquitaine was accused of seducing her uncle. Joan of Arc was burned not only for heresy, but for dressing in men's clothes. These charges were rarely about morality. They were about control. A woman in armor or on a throne was a threat to the fragile patriarchal order, and branding her as evil or unholy was a convenient way to dismiss her accomplishments and justify her removal. The church, too, played a role in the silencing. Monastic writers, who preserved much of medieval knowledge, often omitted women from their manuscripts unless they were saints or sinners. Complex female figures didn't fit their binary worldview. A woman could either be the Virgin Mary or Eve, a Madonna or a monster. There was no room in their script for a warrior, a leader, or a revolutionary. As a result, even the stories that were recorded were distorted, cleaned, simplified, and framed through the eyes of men who feared them. Art and imagery further buried their presence. In illuminated manuscripts, battle scenes rarely show women, even when historical records confirm their presence. Tapestries favor romantic damsels, not battlefield commanders. Cathedrals bore statues of kings, bishops, and male saints, while women, if present, were usually veiled, kneeling, or weeping. The visual language of the Middle Ages reinforced the written erasure. Together, these forces created a narrative so complete, so convincing, that for centuries we believed it. But fragments remained. In private letters, we hear the voices of women asserting power, issuing commands, demanding justice. In court records, we see women suing for their rights, defending their lands, and challenging authority. In poetry and folklore, their stories lived on, altered perhaps, but not entirely lost. These remnants form a mosaic of resistance, pieces that scholars today are finally beginning to reassemble. The 19th and 20th centuries brought a slow rediscovery. As female historians entered the field and questioned old narratives, buried stories began to surface. Archaeological finds, graves of female warriors, weapons buried with women, defensive architecture commissioned by noblewomen, challenged the assumptions of the male-only medieval power structure. In archives across Europe, faded documents revealed signatures of women who had once ruled, written laws, and shaped history from behind walls of stone and centuries of silence. Yet, the process is far from complete. Even today, school curriculums emphasize kings over queens, generals over strategists, men of the sword over women of resilience. The image of the Middle Ages as a male-dominated world still persists, not because it was true, but because it was taught that way. The time has come to correct that record, to lift the veil deliberately cast over the heroines who shaped empires, defended their people, and endured a system designed to forget them. Their courage deserves more than a whisper. It deserves a voice, a stage, a history reclaimed. These women lived, fought, suffered, and led. Their stories were erased, not because they were unworthy, but because they were inconvenient. They proved that strength has no gender, and that leadership does not ask for permission. Now, centuries later, they rise again, not in armor or rebellion, but in remembrance. Their silence ends where truth begins. They fought without glory. They rule without crowns, and history tried to forget them. But today, their voices rise again, etched not in stone but in truth. From battlefields to castles, these women prove that courage has no gender, and leadership wears many faces. Backhand index pointing right if their stories moved you. Then help us bring more hidden heroes to light. Like this video. Share with fellow history lovers. And don't forget to subscribe to History Vault for more untold legends that deserve to be remembered.